Guten Abend, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Mein Name ist Stefan Willer, ich bin Professor für deutsche Literatur an der Humboldt-Universität und ich heiße Sie ganz herzlich willkommen zu den Mosse-Lectures des Sommersemesters 2022 mit dem Titel Welt im Fluss. Ich muss sagen, ich habe hier so einen kleinen Hall drauf. Ich weiß nicht, ob das okay ist, aber also Welt im Fluss. Es wird mithin um die Welt gehen, aber unter einem spezifischen Gesichtspunkt, nämlich dem der Flüssigkeit oder dem des Fließens. Man könnte auch sagen, wir interessieren uns für den Zusammenhang zwischen Globalität und Fluidität. Wir nehmen dabei nicht, was vielleicht naheliegen könnte, wenn man so denkt oder anfängt, die Weltmeere in den Blick, sondern eine andere Art von Gewässern, eben Flüsse. Es geht um Flüsse als Grenzen, als Verkehrswege und Wirtschaftsräume. Es geht um Flüsse, die über die Ufer treten oder austrocknen, um kanalisierte und regenerierte Flüsse und bei all dem immer auch um Flüsse als Orte, aber eben fließende, bewegliche Orte der Erinnerung, der Imagination und der Mythenproduktion. Ich freue mich, dass Sie als Besucherinnen, Besucher, interessierte Zuhörende, als Kolleginnen und Kollegen den Weg in den Senatssaal gefunden haben. Und ich freue mich darüber, dass wir die insgesamt 4 Vorträge unserer Reihe in diesem Semester wirklich in Präsenz, wie es so schön heißt, durchführen werden. Herzlich willkommen, aber natürlich auch den Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauern draußen an den Geräten. Und ein besonders herzliches Willkommen unserer Vortragenden, Hannah Cloke von der University of Reading, die als Hydrologin einen Vortrag halten wird, in dem es um das Träumen und um die Imagination gehen wird. Dreaming of Disaster, a River Journey of Imagination. Und ebenfalls begrüße ich Matthias Kramm von der Universität Wageningen, der darauf respondieren wird. Beide, das möchte ich ausdrücklich betonen, sind mit der Bahn angereist. Bevor ich Ihnen die beiden näher vorstelle, ein paar einleitende Überlegungen von mir zum Thema unserer Vortragsreihe oder vielleicht kann man auch sagen, einige einleitende Assoziationen. Als Lothar Müller und Denise Reimann als das eigentliche ideengebende Team in unserem ganzen Organisationsteam zuerst dieses Thema Welt im Fluss vorgeschlagen haben, ist bei mir jedenfalls sofort die literarisch-musikalische Assoziationsmaschine angesprungen. Ich dachte zum Beispiel an Esther Kinskis Roman Am Fluss von 2014, ein Roman, der als Flussspaziergang erzählt ist, ein Spaziergang entlang dem River Lee im Osten Londons. Und dabei geht es um die Flusslandschaft sowohl als Teil einer urbanen Topographie und Historiographie als auch als Landschaft persönlicher Erinnerungen. Ich sage nochmal den Titel unseres Vortrags, A River Journey of Imagination. Auch darum geht es in diesem Roman von Esther Kinsky. Das Ganze ergibt, wie man damals in den Rezensionen lesen konnte, so etwas wie eine Poetologie des Flusses. Apropos Flusspoetologie, ich habe auch gedacht an Boto Strauß, einen kleinen Aphorismus aus seinem Band Paare Passanten, Anfang der 80er Jahre, wo er schreibt, ohne den unausweichlichen Ausblick auf den Fluss aus jedem Fenster der elterlichen Wohnung, gemeint ist, wenn man das jedenfalls biografisch liest, die Lahn. Ohne vom Fluss einen unausweichlichen Begriff zu gewinnen, wäre ich nicht in die Nähe des Denkens gekommen, so schreibt es Boto Strauß da, und hätte auch nie die andere Seite des Flusses zu denken gewagt, welche die des Nichtvergehens und der Stille ist. Apropos auf den Fluss blicken, mir ist auch eingefallen, Bob Dylans Song, einer meiner allerliebsten Bob Dylan-Songs, Watching the River Flow, wo es in einem der Refrains heißt, oh, this old river keeps on rolling, though no matter which way the wind does blow, and as long as it does, I'll just sit here and watch the river flow. Und dieses "This river keeps on rolling" muss man natürlich hören. Wenn Sie es kennen, hören Sie es vielleicht vor Ihrem inneren Ohr, dieses Rolling hören mit dem rollenden Boogie-Klavier, das Leon Russell in diesem Stück spielt. Also wie dieser River rollt, hört man da auch sehr schön in der Musik. Und apropos Flussgesang mit Klavierbegleitung, ich musste auch denken an Franz Schubert, "Auf dem Flusse" aus der Winterreise, gedichtet von Wilhelm Müller bekanntlich. Wir sind also beim Fluss als einem romantischen Topos, wobei hier bei Wilhelm Müller und Franz Schubert der vermeintlich so typisch romantische, lustig rauschende Fluss schon nur noch eine Erinnerung ist. Der du so lustig rauschtest, du heller, wilder Fluss. Wie still bist du geworden, gibst keinen Scheidegruß. Mit harter, starrer Rinde hast du dich überdeckt, liegst kalt und unbeweglich im Sande ausgestreckt. Und dann beginnt dieser einsame Wanderer in dieses Eis, das aber als Rinde und Decke benannt wird, den Namen seiner Liebsten einzugravieren und die Stunde und den Tag, an dem er sie verlassen hat. Und am Ende in der letzten Strophe heißt es dann: Mein Herz, in diesem Bache erkennst du nun dein Bild, ob's unter seiner Rinde wohl auch so reißend schwillt. Und Sie haben vielleicht im Ohr, wie das Klavier in diesem Lied von Anfang an keineswegs fließt oder gar rollt, sondern im eisigen Staccato spielt und dahin dann auch abschließend wieder zurückkehrt nach einem zwischenzeitlichen reißenden Schwellen. Apropos romantische Flüsse, sehen Sie mir bitte nach, dass jetzt hier bei mir die Assoziationen dann besonders reichlich fließen. Ich habe, was meine Lehrveranstaltungen angeht, ein sehr romantisches Sommersemester. Immer wieder finden sich in den Romanen, den Erzählungen und Gedichten von Autoren wie Clemens Brentano oder Josef von Eichendorff Szenarien, in denen man von hoch oben in ein Flusstal hineinblickt. Und auf diesen Flüssen sind dann oft kleine Kähne zu sehen oder es finden sich Szenen, in denen solche Flussfahrten näher geschildert werden. Sehr prominent etwa bei Novalis in dem Roman Heinrich von Ofterdingen von 1801. Dort findet sich eine Flussszene, die Teil eines wunderlichen Traums des Romanhelden ist. Auch das zielt also auf Imagination and Dreams und zwar tatsächlich hier auf ein Dreaming of Disaster. Denn das ist es, was der junge Heinrich träumt. Ein tiefer, blauer Strom schimmerte aus der grünen Ebene herauf. Auf der glatten Fläche schwamm ein Kahn. Und in diesem Kahn sitzt Heinrichs Liebste, die junge Mathilde, die er in der Romanhandlung gerade erst kennengelernt hat. Aber es ist schon gleich klar, dass das eigentlich die Liebe ist, die ein ganzes Leben halten soll. Und das geht aber nur bis zum sehr frühen Tod, der hier dann schon vorweggeträumt wird. Plötzlich beginnt der Kahn sich in einem Strudel um sich selbst zu drehen und zu kentern. Diese junge Frau Mathilde blickt dabei heiter lächelnd in diesen Strom hinab und versinkt. Heinrich stürzt sich in den Fluss, immer noch im Traum, kommt nicht recht voran. Er folgt ihr teils schwimmend, teils laufend, bis er sich nach langer Zeit plötzlich von hinten festgehalten fühlt. Und hinter ihm, unversehens, steht diese Mathilde. Weiter im Zitat: Heinrich weinte, er drückte sie an sich. Wo ist der Strom? Rief er mit Tränen. Siehst du nicht seine blauen Wellen über uns? Er sah hinauf, und das ist jetzt wirklich eine spektakuläre Verkehrung der Raum- und der ganzen Weltordnung. Der blaue Strom floss leise über ihrem Haupte. In der neueren Romantikforschung wird darauf hingewiesen, etwa von Alexander Honold in einem Aufsatz über Stromkreisläufe bei Clemens Brentano, dass in solchen Flussimaginationen hydrologische Zyklen entworfen werden, die an das Wissen über das Wasser und auch an die Wasserwirtschaft jener Zeit angeschlossen sind. Das gilt insbesondere für die berühmte und berüchtigte Rheinromantik, in dem Brentano in seinen Gedichten und Rheinmärchen und mit ihm viele andere Autoren jener Zeit wie Honold schreibt, Urszenen der gestaltenden Fantasie und der poetischen Rede ins Flusstal des größten und kräftigsten mitteleuropäischen Stromes einbetten, also eben des Rheins, entsteht, immer noch Zitat Honold, ein Bild literarischer Produktion, das wesentlich auf ökonomischer Basis funktioniert und dementsprechend das Zirkulationsmodell eines arbeitsteilig differenzierten Wirtschaftskreislaufes zur Konsequenz hat. Gerade für die Rheinromantik gilt in einer solchen Lesart, dass der Fluss Mythenbildner und Kulturstifter in derselben historischen Situation und geradezu unter der Voraussetzung werden konnte, wie er auch als Wirtschaftsraum erschlossen wurde. Darauf deuten, so ebenfalls Honold, die vielen Mühlen in der Literatur des frühen 19. Jahrhunderts. Auch die sind ja ein romantischer Topos, die klappernden Mühlen am rauschenden Bach. Und zugleich sind sie, nochmal Honold, Prototypen mechanisierter Produktivkraft, die geradezu pars pro toto für die industrielle Revolution stehen können. Von daher wird mir jetzt gerade klar, dass Lothar Müller natürlich ein solches Thema eigentlich besonders interessant finden muss. Welt im Fluss heißt hier also auch und gerade die Verwandlung der Welt, um Jürgen Osterhammels Kennzeichnung für das 19. Jahrhundert zu verwenden. Diese Verwandlung der Welt zeigt sich eben besonders oder exemplarisch an und in Flüssen. Das betrifft raumzeitliche Umstellungen, zum Beispiel wenn sich bei Flussbegradigungen am Rhein schon Mitte des 19. Jahrhunderts, an der Weser Ende des 19. Jahrhunderts die Fließgeschwindigkeiten, also sagen wir mal die Eigenzeiten der Flüsse verändern, die Geschwindigkeiten sich erhöhen. Eine solche raumzeitliche Umstellung betrifft aber auch das Wissen vom Wasser selbst, das mehr und mehr zu einem Wissen vom Wassermanagement wird und auch zu einem Wissen von der Abschätzung der Folgen eines solchen Wassermanagements. Und das heißt ein Wissen von möglichen Zukünften. Und damit sind wir beim Thema der heutigen hydrologischen Mosse-Lecture. And now I will switch to English to introduce to you our lecturer and our respondent. Hannah Cloke, of course, is a hydrologist, professor of hydrology at the University of Reading, England, and we already mentioned that briefly when we talked here. Reading, of course, is a major junction point of British national rail, so whoever went by train in England probably had to change trains in Reading, and maybe this makes train traveling from Reading a little more convenient. Hannah Cloke studied geography at the University of Bristol, where she also wrote her doctoral thesis on modeling riparian hydrology, which means, I think, hydrological modeling in relation to riverbanks. Is that correct? Riparian. After completing her PhD, she participated in the development of the European Flood Awareness System, EFAS, European Flood Awareness System, at a research center in Italy. And this flood warning system was established as a result of the flood disasters in Central Europe in 2002. There is also a global flood awareness system, of which Hannah Cloke is currently the director. Among her research interests, we find prediction of floods or other natural hazards, especially in the context of climate change, early warning and decision-making for disaster risk management. Another research interest, global Earth system modeling and weather prediction, and also forecast verification and analysis of uncertainty factors. So a lot of future knowledge we find here, and I find this extremely interesting, and I think we have a lot to discuss after the lecture and the respondents. Hannah Cloke's research activities are mostly linked to collaborations with other organizations, some of which you find there on the title slide. Others are the UK Met Office, the Red Cross Climate Centre, the Environment Agency, and many others. This overwhelmingly rich research activity is reflected in an immense wealth of papers and studies in geographic and hydrologic journals. Hannah Cloke has received several awards for her scientific achievements, among which the Order of the British Empire, OBE. In addition to her research and, of course, also teaching activities, Hannah Cloke is particularly interested in knowledge transfer and scientific communication. She has been advising governments, authorities, humanitarian organizations on flood events and their forecasts for many years. And she received particular attention from German language media last year when she criticized the responsible German authorities for their, if one may say so, catastrophic systematic failure in the flood disaster of July 21. Matthias Kramm is currently a research associate at a research project entitled Ethno-Ontologies, relating metaphysics and practice of knowledge diversity. Say it again, relating metaphysics and practice of knowledge diversity. This project is part of a research cluster on global epistemologies at Whanganui University, Netherlands. Matthias Kramm is, if I may say so, many things. He studied philosophy in Munich. He worked as an English teacher in Oaxaca in Mexico. He studied theology at the University of London. He served as a cleric, as a chaplain, I think that's the word, at the University of Göttingen. And he did his doctoral dissertation at the Ethics Institute of Utrecht University on trials of a methodology for studying vernacular architecture and its transformations. An ethical dissertation on vernacular architecture. I find it interesting what Matthias Kramm writes about the insights he gained during this project, particularly in his research on cultural traditions in indigenous peoples such as the Sami and the Maori. And I quote a short, very brief text he wrote about it. One very important tradition of indigenous peoples are sacred natural sites like rivers, hills, or trees, which are not merely resources, but beings with intrinsic value that members of these communities relate to. And last topic I'm going to mention before I leave the floor to Hannah Cloke, very interesting paper, I think, for our topic that Matthias Kramm published in 2020, When a River Becomes a Person. You find this paper in the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities. It's about a river in New Zealand, which was the first river to officially receive the status of a legal person. So this is the fluvial and riparian fluid field that we are going to enter now with Hannah Cloke's talk on Dreaming of Disaster, a river journey of imagination. We are very happy to have you here.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Many great towns and cities are built on the riverside, and Berlin is no exception, as I'm sure you know. And just before this lecture, I went out and I walked around a bit, and I looked at the historic buildings and the people. I mean, there was a man dressed as a banana singing. It was a wonderful atmosphere. But I was also enchanted by the elegance and charm of the River Spree. How lucky you all are to have such a beautiful river on your doorsteps. I'm a hydrologist, and that means that I study rivers and floods. But I'm also kind of a fortune teller. I can predict the future. I can see things that have not yet happened. And today I'd like to take you on a special river journey of imagination. A guided tour into some of the most dangerous and destructive natural hazards that this world faces. a voyage through time into the future, but also back into the past, following the pathway of individual water droplets around the world as they fall as rain and as they flow down our rivers. I'm going to show you why I love rivers so very, very much, and also how I became a flood scientist. I want to show you how dangerous rivers can be, destroying homes and lives. And I want to introduce you to our best technologies for forecasting floods, using huge computer models of the whole Earth, showing you how scientists know where all the water in the world is going to go days and weeks in advance. How predicting the biggest floods mean that we need to understand the tiniest of molecules. I want to take you into the future, where we can predict that a flood is coming before any rain has even fallen, or even a storm has begun to form, and how you can use that knowledge to save lives. But most of all, I want to convince you that the best science and the most sophisticated flood prediction systems in the world, running the fastest computers, are all completely pointless unless we can also engage our human nature, our imagination and our emotions. Unless people can imagine and feel the danger that they are in. And I want to show you how fear, love, and understanding together can make the difference in saving lives from dangerous floods. Imagination is one of those powerful human traits that sets us apart from other animals. Imagination is a superpower just waiting to be ignited. So, first, let's see if we can get your imaginations fired up and ready. I want you to imagine, and everyone should have one of these little blue pebbles, hopefully. I heard a few of them like scattering over the floor earlier, so there's some more in the basket over there if you don't have one, and an excellent helper, so do wave your hand around if you need to get one. So I want you to open your hand, and I want you to place the pebble on your palm, like this. And I want you to look at it, really look at it, closely for a few seconds. What can you see? What does it look like? Now close your hand across the pebble. Now we're going to switch on our imagination. And you can either close your eyes, or you can take a big blink. Sometimes that works for me. And I want you to imagine that your hand is still open and that you can see that pebble clearly. You can see it glinting in the lights. It's thoroughly blue. It's shiny and colourful. Can you see it? Now we're going to go one step further. I want you to keep your hand closed, and I want you to imagine that the pebble is actually made of ice. Okay, so it's freezing cold. Feel it in your palm. It's making your skin colder and colder. Maybe it's making you shiver a bit. Still keeping your hand closed, I want you to imagine that it's growing to the size of one of those ice cubes you might have in your kitchen. Okay, it's growing and it's biting cold into your palm. It is melting in the warmth of your hand and it's dripping onto the floor. It's starting to create this huge puddle around your feet. Can you feel the cold? Can you see the water dripping? Now, let your imagination run wild. Okay, what's going to happen next? You get to choose. Perhaps the ice cube is going to grow into the size of some kind of glacier. Perhaps it's going to turn into an ice dragon and fly through the ceiling here. Maybe it will melt so much that it's going to flood this entire lecture theatre here. Our imaginations are wonderful and so very powerful. So what exactly is imagination? Well, it's taking a little bit of what we already know, what we have already experienced, and then it's filling in the gaps. Exploring what might be the missing bits, visualizing, drawing on all those possibilities that we can imagine. But we're restricted in our experience, our perceptions, as Kant would call it, our instruments. Sometimes we don't have enough information to make sense of what's happening at all. It's often said the universe is hidden in plain sight. This is where science and technology can come in, because they can give us bigger, better instruments so that we can see round corners, imagine bigger things. Okay, now your imaginations are warmed up, we're going to take our journey back to the river. So what does the word flood mean to you? What's conjured up in your mind when you think of floods? Just take one moment to think. Perhaps it's images like these that you've seen on the news. Entire villages destroyed, collapsed bridges, cars piled up like toys, people being rescued from the river by volunteers in boats or helicopters. Perhaps you've been flooded yourself, or you have family and friends affected by the terrible floods last year here in Germany. And you understand how it feels to be in danger, to have homes swept away or invaded by thick, mucky water. When your home is flooded, there's huge psychological trauma. Some people take years to get over it, if at all, even after they've dried out and rebuilt their houses. They suffer from post-traumatic stress every time that it rains. Floods are dangerous, and they should be feared. Okay, now let's flex our imaginations again. I want you to close your eyes. You are in your own home. You are in the room where you like to relax and spend your evenings. And in your imagination, I want you to slowly look around the room you're in. What can you see? Bookshelves? Paintings? Guitars? Perhaps your family. Now imagine thick, muddy water rapidly rising past your feet, filling the room. Look around at your possessions, your home. Imagine what it would be like if everything there was destroyed. Watch the water rising. Think of perhaps old family photo albums, priceless memories trashed. For me, I like to think of this music box. This was given to me by my grandmother, and if you wind it up at the back, the little ballerina goes round and round and plays some kind of tinny tune. But, you know, it means something really strongly to me because it reminds me of her. And I think how I would feel if I saw that ripped away, swallowed by the muddy water. Unless you've been flooded before, what I'm asking you to do here is imagine something new, something you've never experienced before. The invasion of floods into your home, into your life. In this talk, I want to take you beneath those dangerous muddy waters of flooding rivers and those things you're imagining right now. We're going to journey around the world, and we're going to see the impacts of some of these floods. We're going to visit Mozambique, where tropical cyclones continue to terrorize, and those parts of Germany that suffered so very greatly in the summer of 2021. I'll show you behind the scenes of the latest science on how we forecast floods. And I'll show you how we're learning about science at every scale, from the physics of the tiny, learning how individual water molecules interact with each other and the world around them, to the physics of the massive, so like large river basins. And I'll take you into the humming computer halls of some of the fastest supercomputers in the world and explain how they do the billions of calculations to predict how all of those things interact. It is very difficult to predict floods, but I'll show you that how, if we use the latest Earth system models, we can accurately predict floods days or even weeks ahead, before the rain has even begun or even before a storm has formed, and how we can use this information together with our imaginations to take early action to save lives and protect communities. First of all, how big a problem are floods? Well, as people often ask me, is this problem really getting worse? The short answer to these things is yes. Floods are a very big problem, however you measure it, and yes, they're getting worse. They're getting worse for a number of reasons as well. According to the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, floods accounted for 44% of all disaster events between 2000 and 2019, affecting 1.6 billion people worldwide. And they're deadly. So the June 2013 floods in India led to more than 6,000 deaths. In 2022, so far, we have seen deadly floods in South Africa, Eastern Australia, Colombia, Brazil, Indonesia, the Philippines, Uzbekistan, just to name a few. In many places, floods have been getting worse because of where we choose to live, or more often, where we have no other choice but to live. And this puts people in the way of floodwaters. We also put more people at risk because of the way that we've changed the landscape. We've built whole cities on floodplains or at the coast. We've cut down trees that help to hold the soil in place. And because humans have changed the climate, we have more heat and more energy in the oceans and the atmosphere, making extremes of weather more extreme than we are used to. Climate change is causing more extreme weather patterns, such as heavier, more intense rainfall, longer rain events that last days or weeks, or a series of rainstorms coming one after the other, clustering closer and closer together. In the past, scientists like me have hesitated to say that climate change causes a particular flood to happen, because river and land has flooded since before humans even existed. But we can now say with increasing certainty that you can see the human fingerprints in the form of climate change and its impacts on our planet, or many of the floods around the world. And what's very clear is that we need to be much, much better prepared for more intense and more frequent flood events in the future. What we also know is that floods hit people living in displaced and poorer communities much harder. This is what happened in Mozambique. Mozambique lies kind of just north of South Africa. It's got a population of about 30 million people. Most of those people live in extreme poverty. UNICEF says that more than half of the population lives on less than 50 cents a day, and that number includes more children than adults. Most of the population live along the coast or in the fertile river valleys, so that means that when floods do occur, then much of the population is in the way of the waters. Mozambique is no stranger to floods. Large floods occur there on average every 2 to 3 years. And according to the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, Mozambique is Africa's third most dangerous country in terms of exposure to weather-related hazards. The coast of Mozambique is regularly battered by tropical cyclones. And what do I mean by tropical cyclones? Here in the Northern Hemisphere, around the Atlantic, tropical cyclones are better known as hurricanes, which is what they call when they hit America. In Africa, they're called cyclones, although they're essentially exactly the same thing, the most powerful storms in the world, hundreds of kilometers across and causing strong winds, storm surge from the sea, and heavy rains that lead to flooding. Here, the warm waters of the Indian Ocean are fueling the storms as the water droplets continuously evaporate and build up these clouds and the structure of the storm. In March 2019, Cyclone Idai hit Mozambique twice. And this is unusual in itself because of the way the storm tracked over the ocean, over the land, before going out to sea again and then coming back as this monster. On its first visit over land, it was a fairly weak storm, but it still brought enough rain and floods to cause huge damage, and it affected more than 3 million people. Then, while the country was just beginning its cleanup operation from Idai, just 6 weeks later, another intense tropical cyclone, Cyclone Kenneth, slammed into northern Mozambique. So we're going to take our tour right into the heart of these monsters. What's being in a tropical cyclone really like? Usually the first thing that comes to mind is the strong winds. We see these dramatic pictures on the news with these characteristic swirling clouds and palm trees bending over and debris from buildings being thrown about. So the sight and the noise of the wind is really dramatic. However, in many cases, the water can be much more dangerous, both for people and for property. Coastal areas can be extremely vulnerable to these waves whipped up by the wind and these storm surges, and that's when the extremely low air pressure in the centre of the storm causes sea levels to rise several metres above where they would normally be. And if you're further inland, with many people living beside the rivers in these fertile river valleys, people are often vulnerable from heavy rainfall, which causes flash floods, landslides, and then rivers to expand out over their floodplains. The impact of the rainfall and the floods are also the longest lasting, so long after the storm has blown away and the wind has died down. And what makes it especially bad is that severe flooding then cuts off communities from the outside world, preventing people from getting into the worst affected areas with the help that they're trying to bring. And it's therefore essential for humanitarian and civil protection agencies to have the right information about the upcoming rainfall and the flood risks. So they get people out of the way before the storm hits. And they can even deliver aid to places that will need it in a few weeks' time. As is often the case for such floods like this, we have no idea how bad the floods got, because no one was able to take measurements in such conditions. And any of those automatic machines which are designed to measure river levels were just completely overwhelmed or destroyed. And this is just one of the difficulties of doing science in a disaster zone. But we do know that river levels went up extremely high and extremely fast in the days following the landfall of the tropical cyclone, and this water stayed there for a long time, taking weeks to go back down again. And then, less than 6 weeks later, just as the recovery was beginning, another intense tropical cyclone named Kenneth slammed into the coast, and we had this severe flooding again. The Mozambique Red Cross was already working on development projects in the area before the cyclone hit. And they were there on the ground, and the volunteers were able to warn people in the communities to take cover, move to higher ground. And then when the cyclone did hit, they were able to evacuate people and provide immediate help to the communities. The Red Cross were in no doubt about the seriousness of the crisis, and they said, "This is the worst humanitarian crisis in Mozambique's recent history. It's a humanitarian catastrophe for the people of central Mozambique. Rescuers are scrambling to pull people trapped on rooftops and in trees to safety. Many families have lost everything." The scale of the destruction was huge. Here you can see roads completely destroyed, cutting off communities and hampering aid efforts. You can see homes completely gone. You can see packed rescue boats. You can see a helicopter being loaded with aid supplies. It's one of the only ways to get to stranded areas and to fly in this aid. But the problem is with helicopters, you can't carry very much. They can only carry a very tiny fraction of what is actually needed. This here on the right is Janio Dambo. He works for the Mozambique Red Cross, and he is one of our research partners in Mozambique. And we're working together on the Fathom project, which is led by my colleague at the University of Reading and the Red Cross Climate Centre, Dr. Liz Stevens. And we're looking at how you can use forecasts of flood for humanitarian action. Janio here was kind enough to provide me with photos of the flooded communities and the aftermath of the cyclone, which were taken by the Red Cross. In this photo, you can see Janio in the city of Beira, in the floodwaters caused by Cyclone Idai. Much of the time, the Red Cross's work in Mozambique is spent with communities, so helping with health programs such as immunisations. And in a country where you've got this really hazardous weather combined with such poverty, they spend so much time just responding to the human disasters that follow storms like these. You can see that Janio here is wearing a German Red Cross t-shirt, and this is because the German Red Cross have been supporting the Mozambique Red Cross in setting up something called forecast-based financing. Now, this idea means that instead of waiting for a disaster and then asking donors for money to help in the rescue and recovery, you can release that money before something bad happens by using forecasts of tropical cyclones and floods and other natural hazards. So if the forecast suggests that a big flood is going to happen, then money can be released so that preparations can be made ahead of time. Altogether, about 1,000 people are thought to have died in these twin tropical cyclones, with close on 3 million people requiring this humanitarian support. Flooding is truly monstrous. Now, I want to take you back in time and introduce you to this little girl here. This is me, aged 9 years old. That's my granddad there. And every summer I went on holiday with my family to see my grandparents in Devon, which is on the south coast of England. And water always plays a big part. If you think about your family holidays, maybe it played a big role for you too. There are those days looking out the windows at the rain, utterly miserable that you can't go outside. There are trips to the beach, swimming in the sea, and there's paddling in rivers and ponds. I absolutely loved doing that, and maybe I just never grew out of that. I remember feeling the current moving through the water and these patterns of the ripples on the surface and how the temperature changed from warm to freezing cold at different depths, and how the riverbed got deeper and then changed shape as you moved from one bank to the other. I remember spending many a happy week swimming in Dartmoor rivers, collecting pebbles, digging and diverting intricate channels on sandy beaches. And this fascination stayed with me through school and university, and while I didn't know it at the time, it helped lead me to a career as a floods researcher. I really do love rivers, and certainly this Easter holidays that have just finished, I've been throwing myself into a freezing cold, spring-fed pool with my family in the English countryside. Although it's really, really difficult now to find clean rivers to swim in. This is the River Amazon. This image I have permanently on the background of my computer screen, and I stare at it all day, effectively. Look at the way that the river is looping and meandering and threading, pushed into these extraordinary shapes by the conflicting forces of physics and chemistry and biology. And I find this image a bit like a puzzle, because the closer you look, the more tributaries you can actually see, these tiny, meandering baby rivers. The Amazon is a huge river. Rivers are beautiful both in their simplicity and their complexity, the swirling and the threading and the beautiful chaos of the flow. And it's this complexity that intrigues me and inspires me every day. And it is essential to be able to work out how rivers flow and to predict when a flood is coming, because as we've seen from Mozambique, rivers are beautiful, but they are beautiful monsters. They have these split personalities. They're drawing people in to live beside them when they're peaceful, and they provide food and transport. But they quickly change character, and they destroy everything around them. So what we really want is the power to be able to benefit from rivers when they're good, but to know in advance before they go bad, with enough advance warning to take action to protect the people and communities. And that's the aim of flood prediction, but it's a really hard job. So why are floods so difficult to predict? I mean, after all, weather predictions have come a long way in recent years. Today's 3-day ahead forecast is as accurate as a 1-day forecast was in the 1990s. But as we all know, they're never perfect, and rainfall is one of those hard bits in the weather forecast to get right. These days, forecasters are pretty good at getting the temperature right, but on many occasions, we still struggle to predict exactly how hard the rain is going to be and exactly where it's going to fall. And that's because we have to be able to predict a lot of different complicated underlying conditions to make it rain. The temperature of the air, the humidity, the direction of the wind, where the clouds are, what type they are, how big they are. And even then, forecasters can still get it wrong. And if you multiply all of that uncertainty within the weather forecast and the complexity of modelling exactly where the water will go and when it hits the ground and how it travels through the landscape, both on the surface and under the ground, then you start to get an idea of the difficulties that we as forecasters face. In effect, we have to take account of all the possible different routes through the landscape that a single raindrop might take. There are billions upon billions of different possibilities. So if we want to stand a chance of knowing what will happen in the future, then this requires lots of assumptions about what will happen now. I think you have to spend time really looking at something to understand it. And I don't just mean with your eyes. Much more important is to use your imagination. I find rivers utterly beautiful. And to this day, and in fact today, I was standing by the river, almost mesmerized by the water. This here is my local river. This is the River Kennet in Reading, where it flows into the River Thames. And I like to watch the eddies spinning and the water upwelling. And it's always creating these types of shapes, like, an emerging dragon or a hippo back or something like that. These are always completely unique. And I find it's like a display of nature, just for me, never to be repeated again. I love watching the flow of the water and thinking about all the many, many droplets that are passing by me right now. Where did each one of them come from? Which pathway through the landscape did they take? When did each drop fall as rain? It can seem a bit like an impossible task to understand the flow of a river. So sometimes I like to engage my imagination superpowers and imagine that I can see every single droplet in the river. I imagine that I can see each droplet clearly as individual blue pebbles, like the ones that you have in your hands. Each droplet has its own history and its own destiny, and I can see them all, I can read them all and follow them all. So let's slow down time and stop it and zoom in until we can see all of these individual droplets of water. And we would see that each droplet is unique and each has its own history. So if we rewind time even further and follow each droplet back to its source, we can find out the story of each drop. Now, maybe this one fell in some really heavy rain yesterday and, it flowed over a street and it went straight into the river. Perhaps this one fell last year and has been sitting in the soil and it was waiting to be pushed out by the force of other droplets from a recent rainstorm. Perhaps this one here fell decades ago, maybe on the day I was born, sometime in the 1970s, and percolated down into the groundwater deep below the surface, slowly making its way through the rocks and finally into the river. Next time you look at a river, perhaps after this lecture, take a moment to stop and really look and go beyond the mass of swirling water before you. Zoom in and look at these little blue pebbles. Engage your imagination and ask yourself, where did they all come from? When did they all come from? And it doesn't have to be a river. Watch the water rushing to the storm drain next time that it rains and you're walking along the roadside. Look up at the clouds billowing above your head. Peel back the layers from your eyes and see those water droplets, because they're there in their billions. We've just forgotten how to see them. And of course, this is all part of an Earth system, and these blue pebbles of water have been around several times, being evaporated up from the land and the sea, transported by the wind, and then rained down again on the land, again and again. It seems incredible, but it's actually trying to recreate this system in a computer model that allows us to forecast floods. Because we can use this idea of the Earth, this giant natural system, to trace these billions and billions of pathways of water. And we aim to predict where they'll go across the land, through the soil to reach rivers, and ultimately downriver to where people live and work. I'm lucky enough to be a fellow of the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, ECMWF, which is co-located in Reading and Bologna and Bonn. ECMWF is an independent intergovernmental organisation supported by most of the nations of Europe. And it's a research institute, but it's also a 24/7 operational service producing global weather forecasts. So I get to collaborate with world-leading experts in meteorology on my research into Earth system models and flood forecasting. The Centre has one of the largest supercomputer facilities and meteorological data archives in the world, and it's working away on the billions and billions of individual options and assembling this picture of what the Earth system looks like now, in a day from now, in a week from now. Global weather forecasting models are basically digital twins of the Earth system, constantly updated with our best measurements and observations from everywhere on the planet, the atmosphere, the oceans, the soil. And these types of models need big computers and lots of physics and lots of observations of the planet. But we're now in a place where we have enough of this information and enough processing power that we can provide flood forecasts for all the major rivers on Earth. This is where I become a fortune teller. The other incredible thing is that these supercomputers don't just predict the future once, they do it again and again and again, with each forecast looking slightly different based on the uncertainty around the underlying data. And each of these individual forecasts is put into a group or an ensemble. And just like a musical ensemble, the end result is a beautiful product that is much greater than the sum of its individual members. By putting all of these different individual forecasts together into a group, forecasters can see how certain they can be in forecasting different elements. They can know how sure they can be about where and when and how hard the rain is falling, and can combine this with the uncertainty and the complexity of the landscape to say not only what the most likely flood scenario is, but what the worst case could be. So while it's maybe most likely that the flood will be a small one, just covering a few fields, it tells you if there's a chance, even a small chance, that it will be roaring through the villages, causing danger to life. And the amazing thing is we can do this all across the globe now. The system is not perfect yet, but we are getting very, very close to be able to provide accurate and timely flood information routinely anywhere in the world. And I work together with a large team developing the Copernicus Emergency Management Service for floods, which provides open access global early detection of floods up to 30 days in advance. And we work closely with the Red Cross and other partners in order to support the research and the implementation of forecast-based financing. So this idea that if you release money before something bad happens by using forecasts of tropical cyclones and floods and other hazards, preparations can be made ahead of time. In March 2019, I was part of a team of forecasters putting this Earth system way of flood forecasting to the test for the first time. And we analysed the tropical cyclone track forecasts. We looked at where and when the cyclone might make landfall, but also where it might be dumping all of that rainfall that it was bringing with it. Several days ahead, tropical cyclone track forecasts indicated that both cyclones, Idai and Kenneth, were problematic, and the global flood awareness system indicated severe flood events. And we could provide emergency reports to the UK government and our humanitarian partners, including the Mozambique Red Cross, to detail what that upcoming flood risk might be. We were able to provide them with crucial information which would previously have been impossible to know. So not only where the cyclone would move next, how much rain was expected, but also which rivers were likely to flood and when. When would the floodwaters recede? What areas were likely to be inundated by the flooding? How many people were at risk of flooding? So, what did happen? Well, the Red Cross and the UK government told us that this was the first time that flood risk information had been provided in real time, and it was extremely valuable to help them plan their aid efforts. And a key contribution seems to have been assisting in creating this situation overview. So where and when was flooding likely to occur? Where were most people at risk? Where are you going to send the boats that are going to go out and rescue people that are trapped on those rooftops? The aid agency used our reports to send assessment teams to the correct areas and move aid items and equipment to the places where they would be needed the most. Janio from the Mozambique Red Cross said they were able to give out chlorine so people could purify their water. And with roads still cut off, the Red Cross used supplies already stored in Mozambique to help people. And these included shelter kits, tarpaulins, blankets, sleeping mats, bucket for clean water. And malaria is always a problem, so they gave out mosquito nets, and thousands of people were evacuated by boat. And as tropical cyclones continue to batter this part of the world, so we continue to work on improving the flood information that we can provide, reflecting on how we can improve, working closely with those who will be using it. Because the storms don't stop, and this year we've seen storms such as Anna and Gombe hit vulnerable communities. Perhaps this is all very encouraging, and perhaps we as hydrologists and forecasters did make a difference in the case of Mozambique. However, forecasts and early warnings are not useful in a vacuum. When I handed in my PhD thesis back in 2003, I went to work for the European Commission in Ispra in northern Italy. It is a beautiful part of the world. It's full of sparkling lakes, its delicious ice cream is just everywhere, and it's got excellent cocktails. Part of my role there was to set up, along with my colleagues, the European Flood Awareness System, the Efas, we call it. It's now part of the Copernicus Emergency Management Service. And as we heard earlier, this was following the disastrous floods in 2002 across Europe, which claimed many, many lives. And the idea is that, this scale of devastation should never take us unawares again. So Efas provides early information on flooding to national and regional authorities across Europe, and it provides that information to the European Commission's Emergency Response Coordination Centre as well, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there are daily overviews on ongoing and predicted major floods in Europe. Our water research group at the University of Reading works closely with Efas and its sibling, the Global Flood Awareness System, the GLOFAS, which we used in Mozambique, undertaking research to improve and analyse the flood forecasting models and data. Now, I don't know what your morning habits are. My husband likes to get up very, very, very early in the morning and run for an hour or two, which personally I think is utter madness. I'm much more of a have a coffee in bed, maybe read a poem, start the day in peace and tranquility. Although that's pretty difficult with 4 kids to keep track of, which is perhaps why he goes running. However, what I do often manage is first thing in the morning, I like to look at the Efas and the GLOFAS systems to see where might be flooding and, crucially, where might be about to flood all over the world. On the weekend before the Germany floods last July, I could see something flagged up in the system for the Rhine Basin. On the Monday, we were discussing it with colleagues saying, oh, it looked like it was going to be a bad flood. And I guess we were stupidly congratulating ourselves on how clever our system was at picking up these floods well in advance and anticipating that these forecasts would actually mean that people would be well prepared for the floods. Efas sends out bulletins of early information by email. They're called Efas notifications. And these are like technical summaries. They're not directly available to the public because they're designed to be read and understood and acted upon by experts. They're designed to create early awareness about the high risk of flooding in the coming days. They're a heads up to warn partners they should be aware that a big flood might be coming in several days' time. An Efas notification was issued to Germany for the Rhine Basin on Saturday, the 10th of July. At this point, we had some indication that flood levels could be serious. As the event neared and the uncertainty decreased, by the 13th of July, it was clear that there would be widespread flood risk. Now, typically, a flood forecaster receiving Efas notifications would use this information alongside that of their own weather forecasts and flood forecast information and assess the upcoming risk for the whole river basin affected. To determine what type of action to take, a flood forecaster is likely to consider, where the rain is likely to fall, the different types of floods that might recur as a result, particularly when the ground is already wet. Of particular concern is when there's a high probability of heavy rain falling on wet ground in steep areas, as this is likely to increase the risk of flash flooding, either caused directly when you get large amounts of water just running off over the surface straight into homes or over roads, or by these very sudden increases in river levels in just a few hours or even minutes. When I woke up on the morning of the floods and I saw the utter devastation reported on the news, I just couldn't believe it. I was absolutely aghast, and I watched with growing horror as reports on the number of deaths rose. And I noted in particular that people were reporting not having had any warnings. The floods that occurred fitted closely with the scale and the distribution of those that were forecast several days in advance. And I was therefore very, very surprised that so many people had died. It was clear to me that something had gone wrong for so many people to die. Something that I have repeated several hundred times in news media, parliamentary inquiries, and public talks. In order to forecast floods, we have to do a whole chain of things. We have to have satellites feeding giant computer models which make predictions and provide forecasts, and these need to be translated into warnings, and the warnings need to be sent out and received by the right people. And those people, those decision makers, need to understand what that information means. They need to understand what to do, whether to issue an evacuation order. They need to understand the uncertainty in that information, how likely bad things are to happen, and also what the consequences of not taking action might be. Forecasting and warning systems also only work when the citizens understand that they are at risk and know what to do when they receive a warning. They must be able to assess that risk and be able to imagine the specifics of what could happen to them. People must also understand that, for example, if there have been 3 previous false alarms, they still must not ignore those warnings or the orders to evacuate. False alarms are annoying, as is leaving your house for no apparent reason, but it is worth it on the fourth time if the evacuation saves your life and the lives of your family. For so many people to die, we must admit that the system has collectively failed. And clearly this whole system, which is designed to save lives by ensuring people act on warnings before floods arrive, it did not work as it should have done, and it had tragic consequences. And while individual parts may have worked, it was clear that in many cases, not enough people did what was necessary to survive. Imagination plays a vital role in science. The advancement of science intrinsically requires the birth of new ideas. Einstein famously claimed that imagination was more important than knowledge in the formulation of his theories. And when researchers test their ideas against reality, imagination is hardwired into the process. The point of science is that it allows you to see the future, to look round corners, to extend the capability of human insight. But here, science has had an imagination problem. Why did so many people die in a flood that was forecast several days in advance? I believe a lack of imagination might be partly behind this, because the scientists could not imagine that their forecasts, delivered in good time and with accuracy, could be ignored. Municipal authorities could not imagine that such dire forecasts might be correct. And many of the people living in harm's way just could not imagine what this 9-meter wall of water would do or how badly they would be affected. The best scientists use many of their human abilities, imagination and creativity, collaboration, communication and empathy to make discoveries and reach new insights. Yet when it comes to telling people about them, we can turn into robots, unable to deliver important messages. Like Cassandra in Greek mythology, or the comet-spotting astronomers in the film Don't Look Up, or perhaps the real-life climate scientists that it's based on. It is a tragedy to see danger ahead when no one acts to avoid it. The most advanced supercomputers running complex simulations are useless if nobody understands the risks that they foretell. By ignoring imagination when we convey science, we are shirking our responsibilities as scientists. If communicating our findings is important, and sometimes lives depend on it, then we have a responsibility to undertake the task with as much flair, creativity, and passion as we use when we do our research. So what can we do? Well, I think that all of us can practice more intentional imagination. And what I mean by that is deliberately engaging our imagination. Imagination is our superpower, as you all saw at the beginning when you were melting ice blocks, creating ice dragons with only your mind. Images, metaphors, and stories are the building blocks of the way that our mind works. All of the most compelling ideas are those conveyed to us in ways that we can see and picture and feel. So as scientists and forecasters, it's our responsibility to unleash this imagination. One of the practical ways forecasters do this is through providing impact-based warnings. And those are warnings that are not based on how much rain is falling, so 800 millimeters in 3 hours, because that means nothing. How many meters high the floodwater will be, that means nothing on the ground. What's important is what might happen to us, what might happen to our homes, what might happen to our families. This is assisted imagination. Here you can see this in practice. This is England's Environment Agency flood warnings. And anyone who sees that there will be a severe flood warning for their small section of river where their house is located or on the floodplain, they know that if they see that severe flood warning, it means danger to life. It means that they need to call the emergency services if they need to. They need to evacuate if they're told to do so. And they've already prepared for this possibility. But what else can we do as an individual citizen? Well, I believe you've started this evening. If you can harness your imagination of water droplets, of these blue pebbles that we followed at the beginning, if you can peel back your water eyes and look around you and see the water and imagine what might happen, see those blue pebbles and their possible futures, perhaps as roaring floodwaters, then when these impact-based warnings do come, you will already have prepared in your mind. But if we are truly to dream of disaster, then we have to engage more than our imaginations. We have to use our emotions as well. And it's easy, particularly for scientists, to dismiss this as unscientific. But emotions are incredibly powerful. We've encountered some of these already this evening, so I've described people's fear of their homes being flooded. You've encountered my love of rivers and landscape, my joy of swimming outdoors, my disgust at seeing rivers polluted. Science needs logic and data and measurement to work. But scientists need much more than that to make a difference. We need to use fear, love, joy, disgust, and all the powers of human emotion to have the greatest impact. Whether that's helping people to understand science or trying to save lives in a flood. Ultimately, love conquers everything. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you very much for this talk, and I'm glad to be the respondent this evening. The river journey of imagination. As you can see in my title, I have decided to pick up on the word imagination and also look a bit at the question, what can we do in order to, let's say, prevent disaster, but before even things get started. So I'm a philosopher. I work at Whanganui University on the question how different communities think about, let's say, nature, water bodies, or rivers. But I don't stay in the philosophical ivory tower. I also walk to other communities, in this case to New Zealand, and just ask them, try to learn from them what it means to imagine rivers in a different way as we would usually do it maybe in a Western society or as the majority of the people would do. And I want to talk to you a bit about this different way of imagining rivers and then also the consequence it had in New Zealand to assign legal personhood to a river, to assign rights of nature to this particular body of water. And in doing so, I will first start with a quick overview of the history of the so-called Te Awa Tupua Act, which is the act which declared the Whanganui River a legal person. I will then talk a bit about legal personhood, what it means in general, and what it means to apply legal personhood to nature, or in this case to a particular river. And I will then close with some ideas about Maori imagination and what we might learn from Maori imagination in our ways of looking at rivers. So we could summarize maybe my talk in a way to say, okay, if we look at a river, what do we see? Is it just water flowing through a landscape? Is it the riverbanks? Are they included? The flora and fauna? Is it just part of it, just accidentally part of the river, or is it something that's constitutive of the river? And from the Maori, then we can learn that a river can also be something we relate to as a family member or as they say, as a tupuna, as an ancestor. It's important to look a bit back into history, the history of the Te Awa Tupua Act, because it's a history of colonization, a history of violence, and therefore it's important to see what the Te Awa Tupua Act actually achieved, both for the Whanganui River and for the Maori, and the relationship between the Maori and the British settlers, the so-called Pakeha. In the 13th century, you have the Maori settle in Aotearoa, New Zealand, coming with their canoes, most probably from the Pacific Islands, and then settling down on these two islands of New Zealand and starting their civilization. So they are there, and 600 years later, the British arrive. And first, it's a bit of a coexistence. The British settle, and conflicts are not visible, but it takes only a couple of years and conflicts emerge. It gets violent, and in February 1840, the idea is to sign a certain treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi. It's signed both by British settlers and by about 40 Maori chiefs. However, there is a bit of a problem because the treaty was translated into Maori, so we have a British version, an English version, and a version in Maori, Te Reo Maori. And both versions have different content. So the question, who is now responsible, who is now basically owning the land, who is managing the land, is differently translated. When in the English document it says that the Maori chiefs submit their authority to the British Crown, in the Maori document it says that they retain some manner of self-determination. So obviously the Maori chiefs signed the contract, thought, okay, this now guarantees that they can remain the rangatira, which means chief in Maori, of the country. But this didn't work out because the British understanding was different. So again, conflicts emerged and even wars were the consequence. If we now look at the Whanganui River in particular, the legal battle is only 150 years old. So it's not that old, and it's a particular conflict between the Whanganui iwi, iwi means tribe, and the New Zealand government. And here, the history is one of from conflict to peace, to an agreement, which is quite unique because the Whanganui River is the first river to be assigned legal personhood worldwide in 2017. We first have the Whanganui River Deed of Settlement in 2014 as a first step, and then in 2017, the Parliament confirms the Whanganui River Deed of Settlement and then also issues the Te Awa Tupua Act. And Te Awa Tupua is the name of the Whanganui River in Maori. So they actually have given it a name. Of course, for a long time it has had this name because it is a family member, and each family member deserves a name. And this name was also then adopted by the Te Awa Tupua Act, the legal document, so that the river is not just treated as a resource, but also as an ancestor, as a living being. It's very interesting how this legal document picks up Maori language and also treats the river not just as a resource, but actually as a living being that human beings relate to. What does the Te Awa Tupua Act do? Well, it assigns to the river the rights, powers, duties, and liabilities of a legal person. And then it declares two guardians, so-called kaitiaki, responsible for maintaining the river's health and well-being. So, for example, if we look at other cases, we don't have the kaitiaki, we just have rights of nature, but here in New Zealand, they adopted also a legal tradition of the Maori and said two guardians should be responsible for the river and for defending its health and well-being. And one of those guardians is a representative of the New Zealand government, and the other one is a representative of the Whanganui iwi. Now, my question is, why legal personhood? It seems a bit of a strange beast within law. Legal persons are usually human beings. We have corporations that are legal persons, and we have some nation states that are legal persons. But why now apply legal personhood to nature? Well, what's, I think, the shift in our perception, in our imagination, if we apply legal personhood to nature, is a shift from anthropocentric law to ecocentric law. Usually we are used to look at nature from our perspective, from the human perspective. And we say, okay, we can only start a lawsuit if human beings are directly affected, damaged, or their interests are somehow affected in a different way. Ecocentric law, however, is very different, takes a different starting point, a different perspective even. Nature itself gets a voice and can then defend itself in court. So it's actually participant of a court procedure. And this often happens via representatives, but if you look at the Maori tradition, these representatives are also very much listening to the river, looking at the river, and trying to represent its interests. So they are not just talking about the river, but they talk on behalf of the river. What could be the rights of the Whanganui River? So, of course, we can be quite clear about rights for human beings. Well, rights for corporations can still be very plausible from an economic point of view. Rights of nation states also if you look at the international community. But if you look at rights for a river, things might be a bit different. And I've just compiled a list of rights that the Whanganui River could have. And this is also a list that I discussed with Maori scholars, Maori elders, in order to learn from them what now should enter this list if we take their particular perspective into account. One of it is to flow unimpeded. Of course, we can have hydroelectric dams. Usually in rivers, we try to use the energy. But what about defining one of the rights as unimpeded flow? What about another option to say that it has a right to contain fish, that it shouldn't be polluted, that it should basically sparkle with life? And connected to that, the right to be free of pollution, which basically means that companies who want to make use of the river water should subsequently conduct a cleanup operation or something similar in order to make up for the harm they have caused. And the last element, the fourth element, to be an ancestor, which is of course very much a Maori perspective, but being an ancestor means that Maori relate to the river as a family member, that they take care of it, and that there are reciprocal obligations. So from a Maori point of view, if they look back in history, they say, I've grown up next to the river. The river has already given so much to me, and now it's my time to give back. So it's not just a question of a description that I make use of the river, that I use the river water, that I enjoy the river, but actually I also appreciate the river as a family member. Legal personhood can then capture this particular Maori imagination and translate it into a still very Western legal framework. So there is still a tension between what rights of nature can do and between the Maori imagination, but I think the Te Awatupu Act is one fascinating attempt to really merge these two different points of view. And if that works out, legal personhood can protect vulnerable ecosystems, they can defend nature against economic appropriation, and for example, river engineering and straightening are very much connected to flooding. We heard about this just a few minutes ago. And legal personhood can also give nature an intrinsic and not just an instrumental value, which then also leads to a different way of looking and dealing with the river, and also, of course, representing it in court. I come now to the last part of my talk with the question, what can we actually learn from Maori imagination? And here we have the image of a marae. Marae are the Maori community houses where they gather for deliberation, for discussing community issues. And the marae is also a place of wisdom and a place of peace. And Maori imagination has very much to do with this communal way of doing things, where people come together and use their imagination in order to see what has to be done. If you look at the Western worldview, nature is primarily a resource. We use a river as, of course, for transport, for transporting goods, but also for hydroelectric dams, for producing electricity, and so on and so forth. It can also be an object that human beings use, look at, and enjoy. And there are several ways of really enjoying this feeling of harmony with nature. I think Maori worldview would somehow supplement this and somehow put let's say, an additional layer to it. Nature is then seen as a community. So the whole of nature is a community of which we humans are but a part. We have active relationships with rivers, also with hills, also with forests, and are obliged to give back what we have received. So this idea of enjoyment is then supplemented with the idea of reciprocal obligations. Reciprocity is one of the core concepts of all indigenous communities that I have been working with and that I have been researching. Kaitiakitanga, I've already mentioned this, the notion of guardianship or custodianship. The translation is a bit of an open question. In New Zealand, we have these custodians who keep an eye on the health and well-being of the river. And hence, the river is represented on a permanent basis. And I think this is something that could also be applied in Europe. So basically to have people who are representing the river in legal procedures, but also defend the river against certain economic interests when the river is in danger. And this is a bit different from the model that they have adopted in Ecuador in 2008, where rights of nature were implemented at the constitutional level. But there, citizens have to start a legal procedure in order to defend nature. This is, of course, costly, both in terms of money and in terms of time, whereas in New Zealand, we have a different case where the government finances a body that is constantly, permanently representing the river. Of course, a couple of questions remain. How can we translate Maori imagination into, let's say, European imagination? Is a change of Western mentality possible? Of course, also in the West, in Europe, most people have relationships to rivers, have grown up next to a river. And of course, consumerism then imposes a sort of instrumental mindset, but I think there's also an opportunity to go back to these very specific relationships that human beings have had with rivers and see what they can do for us, both in terms of emotions, but also in terms of reciprocity. Which Western experiences of with nature can then provide a basis for assigning rights to it, so that it not just remains sort of a legal document, but also something that is felt, that is embodied, and that really builds on an emotional foundation within the population. And of course, the final hard question, to what extent are rights of nature compatible with European or German law? And this is, of course, a question for lawyers, a tricky question, how to implement rights of nature in such a way that it is really compatible with the other laws and that it's effective and not just something that sounds nice but then clashes with other parts of the law that ultimately will overrule rights of nature or rights of rivers. These questions are open questions, are questions that I'm also still doing research on, but I think they are worth our consideration. So thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thanks. That was two very rich and interesting presentations. Our time, the time we actually had, is almost up. So our discussion will probably not as rich as both of your talks have been. And I want to start by encouraging you already to maybe think of questions or comments that you might have. But of course, I would like to start our discussion and maybe do as you, Matthias, suggested, and use this term of imagination that had, I think, quite different aspects in both of your talks, surprising ones, definitely. So, Hannah, your idea of making, well, imagination something that science is really engaged with, but maybe that's already part of my question. So is imagination really a matter of science, or is it an instrument that science or that scientists use to somehow make their results and their research methods and the very complicated way in which computer modeling works more palpable for a broader public? I think you had both ways of framing it. I think you started by saying that you as hydrologists, also as climate scientists, can tell something about the future in terms of knowing the future, not just imagining the future, but in terms of knowledge. In your presentation, Matthias, imagination had a lot to do with indigenous knowledge, and then particularly at the end, you made quite a strict opposition between Western economic, resource-oriented thought and the imaginative way of framing nature in indigenous societies. Maybe that's not the whole story. So there are, of course, Western imaginations, Western culture, ways of thinking about nature with a capital N as something very different, as the other of the economic reason. And maybe, yeah, my question would be directed in a way of maybe overcoming strict oppositions, but particularly making you maybe react to each other in terms of this central term of imagination. Hannah, maybe you would like to start.
Yeah, thank you. So as a scientist, I was kind of brought up to say, we need to stop, we need to concentrate on facts. You need to provide people with facts because then everybody will know stuff. And that's the way the world was supposed to work. But it's very clear that as scientists, we're using imagination all the time when we come up with ideas. It's there, it's intrinsically in everything that we do. So we've got it and we can use it and we don't need to stop. We can communicate much better. We can tell people that there's a giant comet coming to kind of kill us. We really can. So if we do bring that out and we help other people see and unleash their imagination, then we can really make a difference in terms of people's understanding of what's going on. Now, I was fascinated by the different use of imagination in our talk. I think that's really interesting. One thing that really struck me was the fact that I love rivers. I love throwing myself into rivers. But I don't always think of rivers as a living being. So there's a different concept of imagining the river there for me. So that was really interesting for me.
Yes, so the project I'm working in is also very much devoted to see how, let's say, Western scientific knowledge, of course you also have non-Western scientific knowledge, and let's say indigenous worldviews go together, are compatible, can communicate with each other. And if I pushed a bit the dualism between indigenous and Western worldviews, of course, this was also more in order to aim at, let's say, law. So the question, what influenced law, what ideas is our law built on? There's very often the idea of self-ownership, of property, of use. But of course, we also have in the Western world, we have had traditions. The romantic tradition was mentioned. You have Heidegger's interpretation of Hölderlin's Stromdichtungen, which are very much an attempt to understand the subjectivity of rivers. So I still have to enter a bit deeper into that, but I think it's a fascinating topic. But I think in terms of law, I see that our practices and our relationships to the nature around us is still very much influenced by, let's say, a worldview that looks at the river as something that is an object that may be an environment, but it might even be that our actual practices differ from that. So enjoying a river might really create an embodied relationship where you just swim and you become one with the river. But then the way we think about it again afterwards might be a bit more careful in terms of framing that in terms of relationships or letting the emotions basically also have their say.
Could certainly also be interesting to compare what you alluded to, like the classical tradition dealing with personifications of rivers. So a river is a god, or is represented by a god, or the river represents the god, or natural spirits, and how this is linked or differs from the idea of the river being an ancestor. So, and what all of this has to do with the, if I may say so, genuine temporality of a river, like this space in time. So this something that transports not just water but living beings and pebbles, and so. But maybe another question from my part. I think in many European cities, or maybe more generally Western cities, where the rivers were certainly for 200 years or so, or even longer, regarded as resources, and the cities, so to speak, turned their backs to the rivers, or just had mills and factories and everything, that this is somehow being twisted, turned around. So cities opening up to rivers, like in Paris, in Cologne, also on the River Rhine, many other cities. And if I may mention Berlin, since you so politely opened your lecture with saying that the River Spree is a beautiful river. I think I have never heard someone saying this before, but there are attempts to open the River Spree to swimmers. So to have a Flussbad between, well, more or less around here. So touching the Humboldt Forum, the Schloss, and the Museumsinsel, and there are some people who are really working for that, and others saying we are never going to allow that, because this is where the core of Berlin, or maybe even German culture, is located, and we don't want people swimming here or enjoying themselves maybe in a loud way. So this is, I think, quite intriguing how the river as a cultural space is very much contempted and conflicted. But also, and this may be more of the question, the rivers, so that maybe there were reasons for cities to turn their backs to the rivers, not just for exploiting them, but also for a kind of fear, which may be even interpreted as a religious fear, because these rivers can be quite dangerous persons, ancestors. So,
yeah, I think there's a lot to do with the engineering way of thinking. So we're engineering our way out of the danger of floods. You know, we're controlling the river. And that we see that in our cities all the time. We've got the leftovers of this control mindset. And now what we're thinking of is actually, you know, that doesn't solve anything. It's actually creating quite a few more problems. So we need to relinquish that control wherever we can, which of course we can't necessarily do completely in the center of Berlin because so many people are located and, you know, historic buildings are located on the riverside. But where we can let people swim. I mean, what's the difference between people swimming and loud tourist boats going past, blasting information about historic Berlin? Absolutely nothing. So, you know, it's all about perception and that hysteric thought about controlling the river.
Yeah, maybe you have something to...
Yes, I also agree that so if you look, for example, at the Bible as one of the books that had a clear impact on Western imagination, of course, Palestine in the time of, let's say, those authors who wrote the Psalms was very much threatened by floods and the River Jordan. And so one of the oldest texts in the Old Testament psalm is basically also talking about a flood and the danger coming from it. And then, of course, the idea is how can we defend ourselves? And I think it's also in certain contexts a plausible idea because it is dangerous. But I think the time now has come maybe to look at other imaginaries and ways to imagine rivers. And not just look so much at the question how we can defend ourselves, but also at the question how can we coexist with rivers in this landscape.
Absolutely, yeah. I would like to open the discussion now. Anyone? Yeah, please. Yeah, second row.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed for two very original and engaging presentations. I have a question to you, Hannah. I'd like to ask what you see the relationship between imagination and memory. When I was listening to your talk, I was aware of the way in the past we've often recourse to memory to think about past flood events to prepare us for the future. And yet the kind of flood events you're talking about now and that we know are happening are very, very different to previous ones. So they're happening in different rivers. There's runoff problems you were talking about, you know, sewers are flooding. So relying on memory and collective memory appears to be ever less useful. So my question to you is imagination the kind of surrogate medium for communicating floods to memory, or is there still a role for the past and for memory in these imaginations, in these sort of new ways of visualizing different kinds of floods in different kinds of places?
So I think imagination is much easier if you've got some memory to work with. And all of us have got some experience with water, definitely. And there are people who remember bad floods in certain places. But you need, memory much longer than a human lifespan in order to really understand the risk you are at from flooding. And we saw that in Germany, where people were not taking into account previous floods that had happened and had been recorded in some kind of textual or narrative way. That information is excluded from all these complicated calculations that people were making about flood risk. But, going back even further, there were bigger floods. We can see from the landscape around us, we can see the shape of the landscape. You can see a floodplain which has been created by a big flood. So we can see in the landscape this history of what has happened. So memory plays a really important role in thinking about future floods. But you're right, we're seeing different floods now. We're going to get different floods in the future. And we have to be able to grasp that memory, that experience that we have, and twist that and shape it into something new. So I think you're right, we definitely need to build on those memories, and we need to build on as many as possible, including all those ones from the 1700s and 1600s that we have information for, and grasp that all together, but then look to what those possible futures might be, particularly with climate change. Thank you.
In order not to exceed our time too much, we can take one more question, or it's actually two. So I see two hands, and we will have both of these questions, please.
Yeah, my question is also for you, Hannah. Thank you so much for your talk. You were talking a lot about the floods that happened in Germany as well, and since you were kind of have first-hand experience with the system and the warning systems, I was wondering, you talked a lot about imagination being the problem, and especially our lack of imagination. I was wondering if technically we had the solution on hand. Was there also a problem in communication, or was it purely that everybody just said, you know what, that could never happen? Like, were we talking about this and we just didn't get it, or was there a communication problem as well?
I think in some places this communication worked well, and warnings were issued and evacuations took place. In other places, I think there were many breakdowns along that system, and I think that lots of failures of imagination in a row happened, right from those people who were doing the forecasting and perhaps didn't have the experience to know that that actually was a possible flood that they could see and not an error in the system or whatever else you might think of if you didn't have that experience, right down to those people who chose to go into the cellar to get something out when, a large wall of water was coming towards them and couldn't see that danger that they were in. So I think there are lots of points of failure that we need to address along that system, and that's a big job, and that requires investment and political will, and collective responsibility, because it could be somewhere else the next valley, it could be somewhere else in Germany next time, it will be somewhere else next time. So everywhere needs to have the same kind of preparations. Thank you.
And last question, please, sir.
Yes, hello. As a student of literature, both of your talks are kind of stories to me. And so all these stories are about struggle, they're about violence, they're about power, which is, violence and power, this is the same word in German, actually. And all of these stories, or these kinds of stories, to me, always have some kind of utopian ideals in them. And that will be my question to you, maybe also to close on a positive note. Apart from what you said already, what are kind of your visions of a utopia that could maybe have the best solutions for humans and nature to live together in a harmonious way?
Okay. Then I start. Yes, I think there is a utopian vision underlying this, and especially taking the Te Awa Tupou Act as a role model of how Western or legal systems can be transformed by indigenous imagination in terms of perceiving nature as one participant in organizing our societies. So in the court, but also in other deliberations. Of course, we still need to find out how we can then listen to rivers, let's say, defend the interests of rivers, and so on and so forth. But the idea would basically be to include rivers and other natural entities in the way we organize our society. Yeah.
I think from my point of view, I would like everyone in the entire world to understand these blue pebbles. I haven't got any left, but hopefully you've still got yours. Because if you can get, small children to understand this concept, they can see the water around them, and they can see what it might do in the future. They can really understand what those possible futures might mean for them. Then they'll be able to keep themselves and their future families safe. So it's really understanding the water in the landscape, seeing where it might go. And then we start to do other things like swim in the Spree, or not use all of our drinking water so there's none left for other people. We really start to live properly with the water around us.
Thank you very much, Hannah Cloke and Matthias Kramm, for the lecture, the Respondenz, the discussion. Next lecture in this series will be on 19th of May. Terje Tvedt will be talking about the Nile. So, thanks very much, and have a nice evening, everyone.